I don't know if I really need the microphone, but this is Dustin Foote. He is the assistant curator at Sylvan Heights. So hopefully all of you guys were there yesterday. Most of you guys were there. And he takes care of the flamingos there. So he's going to be talking on breeding lesser flamingos there, which I just have to say I love the flamingos. I'm a parrot person, so it was really fascinating to be able to feed non-parrots. Which is not really the scientific name, but anyways, he's originally from New York, and he's going to be talking about that. Before we start, though, I am going to tell you, make sure your cell phones are silent, and he's going to be taking questions afterwards.
Yeah.
Yes.
Probably throughout it.
Yes.
There's not many people here, so keep it informal.
Yes. So if you have any questions, he says you can interrupt.
Yep, no problem.
And this is Dustin Foote.
Big crowd here. Thank you. So my name's Dustin. Like she said, I've been at Sylvan for about 2 years now as the assistant curator. Before that, I graduated actually from college in New York at Cornell. My undergrad was in animal science, and I did concentrate on birds though, and I've been into birds since I could walk basically. While I was doing my undergrad, I did a lot of internships. I worked out at the San Diego Zoo, at their Hawaiian Avian Center on the island of Maui, and I also worked at Emerald Forest Bird Gardens, which is one of the largest producers of toucans in the world. And I did an internship here for just about 4 weeks, about 3 years ago, and I love the facility, I love the people, and ever since then I knew I wanted to come back and work at Sylvan. And pretty much everybody visited Sylvan yesterday, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. You guys like it? Good. Good to hear.
Brad.
Yeah, Brad's pretty awesome. Brad's one of the reasons I'm here. So what I'm going to be talking about is our lesser flamingo breeding program, which was actually started by Brad Hazelton, the general curator. Back in 2007 was when he started with lessers at Sylvan. But Brad is actually one of the first people that started really concentrating on lessers back when he was the curator at Fort Worth Zoo. And he was one of the first people to really import them and really start focusing on them. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But to start off with, Sylvan actually has 3 species of flamingo. We used to have all 3 species together, and we didn't have any aggression problems. So there was a little bit between the larger American flamingos and the second smaller Chilean flamingos. But our biggest problem was actually pair bonds forming between the wrong species. And it doesn't sound like a huge problem, but when a pair bond forms between a flamingo, it takes them a couple years to form the bond. And then once you split up those birds, it takes them even longer to break that bond and then to form another bond of the right species. And so it's a pain in the butt when you have, a Chilean and American, and it's like a 6-year switch to get them back with their own species. So this guy right here is a really nice looking Chilean. This is actually one of our birds. You can tell that she's not mature yet, but her legs aren't really red yet. When they're young, they kind of have several different plumage phases they go through until they reach their adult colors. And once they're in their adult stage, their pigment really starts showing through, and you get the bright red feet and the bright red feathers. The next guy coming up, this is one of our American flamingos. Some people call them Caribbean flamingos. You notice that this is, when everybody thinks of the lawn flamingo, this is the flamingo that you're thinking about. It's the bright pink, super long-legged, big bird. They're very, very charismatic birds. And these are the guys that we sometimes have problems with aggression. And then our next guy is the one I'm going to be talking about, and this is the lesser flamingo. And so these guys are really cool birds. They're the smallest species of flamingo. There's only 7 species of flamingo. And these guys are found in Africa. They're not migratory. They do migrate sometimes, and they're found on salt lakes throughout Africa.
Those are really white.
Sorry?
They're really white.
In our flamingo pen?
Come around through the bathrooms, you come through the
Yeah.
cages, and you come out that last cage, you go across that crosswalk.
Yeah.
You got those really white ones.
Yeah, those are both the Chileans and the lessers. Lessers, I mean, this is a nice looking lesser right here. You see the flecking? You see the flecking in the breast?
Yeah.
That's about as pigmented as they get. And their secondaries are also really pigmented. And sometimes you get really nice crimson flecks on their back. But their plumage is pretty white, even in the wild. Ours are pretty bleached out, but our biggest problem is did you guys visit Interactive?
Yeah.
That's where we have the Americans, and you notice they're just starting to get in this year's feathers, and those feathers are really, really bright because we got on top of our guys for keeping up with the pigment. They actually get a supplemented pigment. It's not part of the pellet that they get, and so they're starting to just get in their colors. But a lot of people think that our flamingos are really white, and these guys aren't really supposed to be as pink as people think, and that's one of the reasons. But they're Chileans and lessers, the ones you were asking about. We actually use 2 types of pellet. It's not ideal, but what we actually do for our flock is we feed them our waterfowl pellet throughout the non-breeding season, which is a 15% extruded protein diet, extruded pellet. They just get it in a shallow bath, which I have a photo of later, and we actually just add a purified, I think it's xanthantine pigment. Yep, that's right there. and that gets dumped on top of the pellet every day. So it's in a water bath. Can I answer everybody's question? I think so. Okay. Like I said, this is the American. I'm going the wrong way. And this is just to show the size difference between the birds. This one closest to us is the lesser. I believe this right here is the American, and right here should be the Chilean. This is the Jameson, and this is the greater flamingo. And I get these two mixed up sometimes, but Andean and the James, are they? Okay. But these are the 3 we have, the lesser, the Chilean, and the American. And you notice the size comparison between these guys. These guys actually can produce offspring if they were to mate. But we never really have these guys forming up in any of these ones. This is the entrance to our aviary that you guys saw yesterday. And basically people are allowed to walk through on this end and then exit right here. And then on this opposite side of the aviary is bordered by our African exhibit. And there's actually thought behind that. It's not just that we're sharing the fence line, it's a fence line that people can't approach. And so when you're dealing with flamingos, they're obviously a flock bird, and they stay relatively calm when they're in big groups. But when you start breaking them up, they get spastic really, really quickly. When they get spastic, a lot of bad things can happen. And so this aviary was designed so that people would enter in this end, they would see flamingos right here, but flamingos could go all the way in the back and really be isolated and not nervous. And this slide, I just wanted to put in here to show the size difference between, these are greater flamingos, and this is a young, or an adult lesser flamingo. And this is actually what you would see in the wild, is lessers and greaters in the same breeding colony. So back, I think it was in 2007, is when Sylvan first imported its lesser flamingo colony. We actually were aiming for about 100 birds. We ended up getting 96, and I think through quarantine we got about 86. And out of those 86 birds, we only ended up with 14 females, which was a pain in the butt. The facility that we built was estimated for about 25 pairs, so 50 birds. And so that kind of put a downside on our initial breeding program. But we think there's a few reasons behind that. There's a big size difference between the sexes of flamingos. Males are considerably larger, probably about a third larger than the females. And so when people were catching up the young ones to send to us, they were probably targeting the more robust, larger chicks, and those were probably already the males. And then during quarantine, I would assume that the smaller females had a harder time adjusting to the new conditions and competing in the new conditions. So out of those 10 mortalities, my guess is they were mostly females, which was a bit of a pain, but we're starting to get back into it. We're up to about, I think, 18 females now. So these are the crates that they came in. We got them, I think, early spring, and they were put directly out into our non-breeding area. You notice that the crates were padded on all sides. The flamingos could sit down, but they have no headroom, so they really couldn't damage their heads if they were to jump. 1 second.
How many are in a crate?
4 to a crate. So this is a crate that's, I think, 4 by 4 by 4, and it has 4 compartments, and they're all individual compartments. And they were all mosquito proof. When we first got them in, they were all vaccinated for West Nile. We haven't administered any boosters since, but we haven't lost any birds to West Nile either out of our flamingos.
The last one was West Nile 3 years ago
That's too bad. Where are you located though?
in California.
Cal- If you have any questions about West Nile, Lori back here can really answer them. Besides the initial West Nile booster, when we really don't have many health problems in terms of the birds getting sick. Their biggest problem, I think, is a slide. I'll get to that in a second, actually. Sorry. This is part of the breeding area of our structure, and it's a building that's about 50 feet long by probably 20 feet wide by 10 feet tall, and it's divided into 2 halves. One half is what we call the nesting area, and it's surrounded by mirrors, about 4-foot mirrors, and it's solid clay. You can see the clay nest mounds down here. And the other side is a shallow pool, and it's only about 2 feet deep. And it's just a cement pool that gets cleaned every day. And like I said, this area was built for about 50 birds, and there's only about 30 in here right now. And you can see how densely packed they are in there. And that's for a reason. In the wild, I have some pictures later on, and you'll see how they are in true colonies. And they really, really need that fighting interaction to gear them up for the breeding season. If we were to leave them in our non-breeding area, which is where you saw the white flamingos, their nests would be about 10 feet apart, and we probably wouldn't have any fertility because they're not actually fighting with each other and the hormone production's not there. And so that's why they get packed into this. When Brad first designed the Fort Worth flamingo aviary, he actually based it on several other lesser flamingo groups over in Europe. And there was one guy, I think he was in Germany, and I believe I have a photo of his aviary later on. He was doing it in one of those prefabricated garden sheds, those little 10 by 8 structures you can buy at like Lowe's. And he had like 25 birds in there, and he was getting about 10 chicks a year, which is impressive. And that's what Brad designed his pens around.
We didn't see that building yesterday.
Yeah, it was the one attached to the aviary. It's a log cabin style. There was just a double door in front into it. Yeah, and there's a reason why it's attached to the aviary. That's way we don't actually have to pick up the flamingos when we transport them. I'll talk about that a few slides later on why it's attached though. And this is just a photo of the different foot problems. We have hardening of the tissue, skin fissures, and this, I think it's papillomatous growth, and then we have bumblefoot sometimes. The biggest problem we have are the fissures though, and if I've talked to a few people that have flamingo colonies on the ocean, and they actually have the ability to pump salt water through their flamingo ponds, and they don't have a bigger problem as we do. If we had the facilities to do that, I think that's what we would do, and it makes sense because in the wild these guys are found in salt lakes, and so they wouldn't have the bacteria count that we have in our pools.
Do y'all ever add salt to your
We can't really, because all of our pools are flow through, and so they constantly have new water, and it would just cost if we couldn't do it.
Is your feeding area in a different
Yes,
place?
our feeding
So
area.
you could put another sub-pool there
We've-
and the food in the center, but it's...
We thought about doing like a trough. I have a photo coming up, in our pool, our feeding pool is an 8-foot circle on one end of the aviary, and then the flamingo's pond is on the other. And we thought about doing a shallow trough that they would actually have to walk through,
Right.
and that's not off the table yet. But this hasn't been a huge problem. We'll maybe have 1 or 2 birds that have it each year, and they get put inside on rubber mats. They get a broad spectrum antibiotic, and they get pampered for a couple weeks, and they go back out, and they're usually fine. This is Brad. I'm sure most of you guys know who he is. So this is actually the structure that you can see, that you saw yesterday. You can see the breeding colony back here, and I put this in here because I wanted to talk about how we service the breeding area during the breeding season. It's actually just Brad and myself that enter the breeding area, and that's for several reasons. The birds really get used to us. This is a confined space, and a flamingo in a confined space is usually a recipe for disaster if they're flighty birds. And so they really get used to Brad and myself, and they usually calm down by the third or fourth day that they're in there. And at the same time, Brad and I are able to recognize individual birds, and so we can kind of see different behaviors, and we can pick up on odd behaviors or good behaviors when we're doing the service. And that being said, when the birds were first brought in from Tanzania, they were all assigned a different color band, 2 zip ties placed above the tarsus, and that allowed us to take notes on individual birds, and we could start to see different pair bonds forming. And so once pair bonds formed, we knew which birds had formed the bonds. We could actually give them the same zip tie combination, and that's really, really useful when you have a pen full of 20 pairs, and double yellow and double yellow, they're working on this nest mound, but gray left, gray right is moving in on it. And throughout the breeding season, we can kind of see how the flock shifts. And one of the easier things for me in terms of that is we do have male-male pairs that form because of our skewed sex ratio, and they're actually really, really helpful. When they're in the breeding area, I think we have about 4 male-male pairs. And like I said, the flamingos have that size difference in the sexes, so a male-male pair can actually defend a nest mound better than a female-male pair. And so when we do get eggs, we'll actually give them to male-male pairs because the chances of it getting kicked out of the nest are much less than a male-female pair. This I put in here. We usually actually do not parent raise most of our chicks. This is one of the first chicks we hatched out. You can see this is the male standing above her, and then this is the female right here. So you can see there is even though he's in the forefront, there is a size difference. And then you can see the different color bands on the legs. And one thing that a lot of flamingo people don't realize is how gray lesser flamingo chicks are. Chilean or American chicks are really, really white when they hatch out, and whereas lessers are very, very gray. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Back to what you were saying before, you said that the different species stay together in the wild?
Yeah.
And you said that sometimes at Sylvan pair bonds form between different species. Does that happen in the wild?
It might not. What I was actually referring to is it's a greater and a lesser. So greater is actually the largest species of flamingo, and lesser is the smallest. So I would be impressed if they were to form pair bonds, because our lessers don't even mess with the Chileans really. This is to show the inside of our aviary, but it really helps that you guys saw it all yesterday. This is when they were first being released. But you notice that our aviary is actually netted, and that's actually a big difference between a lot of flamingo colonies in most zoos and anyone in private aviculture. That allows our birds to be fully winged, and that's a kind of a heated topic, and in both my and Brad's opinions, actually very, very important for a flamingo to be fully winged. There's several reasons that is. In my mind, one of the more important reasons is a lot of long-legged birds like cranes and flamingos, when they copulate, it's the male that mounts the female, obviously, and with those long legs, it's hard for them to balance on top. Most copulations happen with the female actually sitting on the ground or in the water, but standing females have been seen being mounted. And so if a male is missing half of his wing, he spends a lot of his time falling off. And I think Brad said when he was at Fort Worth, he didn't have a single pinioned lesser male fertilize an egg. But I believe he said there was been one since he left or something.
So when the female, like you said, and
Sometimes. Most of the time they're on land when I've seen them, but from what I've read, they're usually in the shallow water.
Okay.
But our nest area doesn't really provide them with a lot of options,
Yeah,
to be honest.
I mean,
So they're either in the nest mounds or they're in the shallow water. This right here is just to show a few of the different courtship rituals that flamingo do. And you can actually see that they use those black primaries in most of their courtships. And so if they're missing half their black primaries because they've been pinioned, it really cuts down on the display. And we have a few pinion birds in our flock from other zoos that we've gotten in. And in my mind, I'm sure I'm making some of this up, but they don't seem to do it as vigorously as our fully winged birds do. And so when they're doing these group courtships, that's a way to regulate the whole flock, and it kind of syncs the flock and gets the hormone production all in the same cycle. And so if you have a bunch of non-vigorous birds, it kind of throws the whole thing out of whack, I think. But up here we have these are called wing salutes. There's an inverted wing salute, which I believe I have a photo of as well. Yep, right here. So you can see how the bird will actually extend its neck and stretch out its wings and show the black primaries. And they usually go back into a twist preen when they're done with that. I always thought I've always liked flamingos, but I didn't realize how interesting they were until I started working at Sylvan. If you were to stand back, we have a bench to the left of our aviary, and one of my favorite things to do after work is to go watch the flock. And most actions that they do have some significance. They don't really do anything that's not related to the entire flock. And so even this wing stretch, it's called a wing stretch, leg stretch, that's a type of courtship. And right here, this twist preen is another type of courtship. And you'll notice when we approach the breeding season that during the non-breeding season, I could see how it would be mistaken as just an act or behavior, but they really get into it when the breeding season approaches. And then this next one, they have this flagging of their bill, and the lessers, they do it pretty well, but it's the Americans that really get into it. And when the whole flock we only have I think 13 Americans, but I've seen other groups, and it's really nice when you have the whole group flagging their bills. And then this last one is marching, and so that's another really cool thing. Our breeding grounds don't really allow for the marching, but prior to the breeding season, we'll see the outdoor area. We'll see some good marching, and that's when they get in these tight groups and they get really stiff in their movements and they just march back and forth, and it's kind of cool to watch. And this is a nice group of lessers. This actually is color enhanced. So when I was saying that they're not really pink, this is color enhanced a bit, but they look really pink. And this next one is just a photo of a standing bird. These are Chileans being during copulation. So you can notice how if he was missing half of his wings, his balance would be pretty far off. Any questions about that?
Shortly after Christy got back, we really hadn't observed any
Yeah.
behavior, and we had about 3 all at like 1, and
Yeah.
she was just like,
That's cool.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Dustin, what have you noticed about vocalizations? Do you see a difference between the lesser, the Chilean, and the American? Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, she was asking if we saw a difference between the vocalizations between the lessers, the Americans, and the Chileans, and there is a good amount of difference. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but our lessers, we have probably about a total of about 65 birds, and that's a good sized group in captivity, but in the wild that's nothing at all. But our lesser group actually gets pretty good vocalizations. They especially during the breeding season, there's a lot of grunts. There's this contact call that you hear between the male and the female. It's this very high pitched contact call, and you can tell how into breeding the flock is by how noisy they're being. Whereas our Chileans and our Americans, there's not really enough of them, so they don't really get as robust as our lessers. But they still have the grunts and the high-pitched contact call, but it's not something that I've really picked up on because our groups are so small. When before the breeding season starts, we actually push the entire flock inside, and that's why our building is attached to the end of the aviary. If you notice, the whole aviary is shaped like a funnel, and that was for that reason, so we could just march all the birds inside, and then either Brad or myself or maybe Mike will be the only person that enters the building. And it's actually a really, really difficult thing to do when you enter the building, because it's basically the size of this set of chairs. And you walk in and you have a group of 65, 70 birds, and you have to single one out and fold it up and then walk it back out the door so that we can inspect it, check its bands, and then see if it's a breeding bird or if it's a non-breeding bird, so to see where it goes. And the best I can describe it is when you walk in, you don't want to make eye contact with the flock. You kind of look with your peripherals, and as you start to walk towards them, you'll notice that one of the edge birds kind of slips out, and then you turn and you focus on that bird. And as long as you're very deliberate in your actions, the whole flock won't freak out. But I think it was 3 years ago, Brad let an intern try to do it, and we had birds bouncing off the wall, and it was not good. But you notice, I mean, in the wild, this is how dense they are. So if you have 60 birds in a room, they're all smashed against that wall. So it's really hard to pick one out, and it's something it's hard to teach as well. And you basically just have to have good bird sense. So, I mean, we're all bird people here, and you have to read the birds, and you know when they're nervous, you know when they're about to jump, and you just have to respond accordingly. Yeah.
About how long does it take to transition them to a new person?
A week. The problem is we have a staff of maybe full-time for the birds, maybe 5 people. That's including Brad and myself, and then we have interns all the time, and we have volunteers all the time. And so in terms of regularity, who's going to be there the whole time they're indoors, it's really down to like 4 people. And so that's why it's just Brad and myself that go in there. But they would adjust pretty fast. It's just that we can't keep on doing that. When we do push them inside the breeding area, that's really the only time we have any types of injuries. And this is a young American, and she just had a slipped tendon. And what we actually did is just made a sling for her, and this is actually a piece of wire wrapped around the tendon holding it in place, and it actually popped back in, and she was walking within a week. And like I said, that's really the only time we've had any foot problems with it. And
the smaller one.
yeah, this is just a lesser, and when you have one flamingo by itself is going to die. They really need a contact, and so it doesn't have to be the same species. We just had a young Lester in there with her. This is looking out into the aviary from our breeding area. So you notice here's our feeding pool. It's just a shallow pool. It has constant water running into it, and then this is the main pool. We were thinking about putting that trough right about here with the salt bath that they had to march through to kind of help with the foot problems. These are some old world comb ducks in the flock as well. So once they're inside, there's actually several reasons that we have an indoor breeding area for them. Like I said, we need to have them in a compact space, but this way we can control both the photo period and the temperature. So we actually move them inside around January, and so in North Carolina it's still pretty cold in January, and the daylight's not what they would need to start their hormone cycle. And so we actually give them about 14 hours of daylight. The lights come on around 4 in the morning or so, 3 in the morning depending on the time of year, and they go off shortly after sunrise, and that way we can cut down on our light bills, but they get the full extended from 4 to about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And you notice that this pool is only about 2 feet deep.
What's the purpose of the mirrors?
That's to simulate the flock. So when you're in there and the mirrors are clean, it looks like there's 5 times as many birds. I've talked to Brad about this quite a bit, and it's one of those things where there's no reason it would hurt the birds, but I'm not actually convinced that it helps the birds. The other day, we were talking about sound vocalizations, and that's some people who breed flamingos play sound recordings of a really healthy, active, vigorous flock, and that's thought to increase their hormone production and get everybody else in gear too. And it's just one of those things where that's a hard thing to prove, but I wouldn't see that hurting anything at all.
Are they just regular mirrors?
Yeah, they're I think they're shadow resistant. Yeah. We're pretty good about cleaning them before birds are nesting, but once there's eggs in the nest area, they really don't get cleaned, because when you walk this way, the entire flock pushes this way, and even the best sitters will get off the nest, and when they get off the nest is when you see eggs roll. That's never a good feeling. This is that garden shed I was talking about that Brad based off his original, and you can see how small it is. This pool ends like right about here, and it's just a shallow trough, and there's more birds, and you can see how many eggs he's getting with that amount of space. This is in that same area. One second. We really don't artificially incubate many of our eggs that we get with the lessers. There's a couple of reasons for that. They're not actually difficult eggs to incubate under the parent or in incubators. But having eggs in the nesting area is actually good for the whole flock. It kind of keeps the whole flock on the same task. And this is actually the incubator that we've been using for our eggs. We have 7 Chilean chicks right now, and I think we still have 4 eggs left to hatch out, or 3 eggs left to hatch out. And this is just an Arcom desktop incubator. They're Arcom 20s, and we've been having great luck with them. We got our first one about 2 years ago, and you see in this over here, these are still eggs, avocet eggs. This is a lesser egg, and these are 2 Argus eggs. And so that's a very
Oh, I'm sorry, what temperature do you?
99.5.
99.5
Yep.
and 50%?
Yep, 50 to 55%. And when the eggs are in here, we turn them all the way up till they pip, and when they pip, they just get put into a high humidity hatcher, and that's when they get stop being turned. But you notice over here how these are very different types of birds. Argus need really high humidity. The shorebirds are lower humidity. The lesser is kind of in between, about 50%, like I said. And this Arcom just hatches everything I put in there. We last week, I think we were up to 11 white-headed duck eggs, or white-headed ducklings. So a white-headed duck is a Spanish version of our North American ruddy duck. It's a type of stiff-tail, and stiff-tail eggs are extremely porous, and so they're actually really, really hard to incubate. Even our ruddy duck eggs are actually all hatched out underneath real birds. And in the beginning of the year, I tried starting from day one a clutch of ruddy duck eggs, and they all hatched out. And so we started putting all of our white-headed duck eggs through it, and we've hatched out, I think, 10 of 11 eggs, and the chicks are doing great. And so these incubators I've been nothing but impressed with.
Do you all monitor like the weight loss on the egg?
We don't monitor the weight loss, but I handle them every day for just the air cell development. We in these desktop ones, we only have 20 or 30 eggs, but on the other side we have thousands of eggs every year. It'd be impossible. But if we could, that'd be a great thing to do. When the chicks hatch out, they are fed 10 times their first day, so every 2 hours from 6 a.m. till 12 o'clock at night. And what we actually do is we actually tube feed them. So a soft tube is actually inserted down the esophagus into the crop, and the whole formula is pumped in. And that's very exact. You have to know what you're doing, obviously, otherwise it's very easy to aspirate a chick. But when we're dealing with flamingos, it's a good thing for us because they need exact amounts of food. So when we monitor their growth, we're actually monitoring for too much growth. That's one of our biggest problems, because they are long-legged. If they outgrow their legs, their legs give out, kind of like large breed dogs when you have them started off. And so having them tube fed allows us to exactly monitor how much food they're getting. And this is Brad again.
I think
If you notice, that first PowerPoint you pulled up is his old PowerPoint, and there might be some. Yeah. And this is another lesser. When the chicks are growing, they start, like I said, they start off at 10 feeds, and by a week they're down to I think 5 feeds. So we'll feed them starting at 8 o'clock, and they go to about 9 o'clock at night, and we're shooting for about 7% weight gain. And so between 5 and 10 is very acceptable, and we usually don't have to adjust our allotment with our birds lately. We actually started using a different formula about, I think, 4 years ago when we first got the lessers in, and it's a formula made in-house, and it actually has egg yolk, fish, and shrimp, all equal parts as the main components of the formula, and it's just a blended diet. Besides that, it has calcium, thionate, and baby cereal, and some water, and that seems to be working really well. When Brad was in Texas, he had a similar diet, but it was a more oil-based fish, and he constantly had to reduce the amount of food he was giving because the birds were growing too fast. Whereas ours, we pretty much hit 7% on the head every day, so that's pretty nice. We give them access to adult food by day 10, and if we're late a few days, it takes them twice as long to take to the food. So they usually get access to adult food by day 10, and I know a lot of places give access to adult food earlier than that. The adult food serves several functions. Obviously, you're weaning the bird, but our formula has really, really small particle size, and so when they have the adult food, the particle size is different, and it's good for their filter apparatus when it's developing to have that varying particle size. If they were to just stay on our diet, they're kind of behind the curveball when it comes to growing that. And this is, you can see how we do it. We just weigh everything out in the fish and the calcium and the eggs and blend it up. And when we feed it at 105 degrees, and that's basically so we just don't cool the chick when we put it into its stomach.
So do y'all hand rear the whole way through, or do y'all put them back with the parents?
Yeah, we hand raise them all the way through, and we actually, when we hand raise, we hand feed for 3 or 4 months. I have a lesser right now was born on 5:30, and she's still on 2 feeds a day, and she's not even done. A lot of people get them weaned a lot sooner than we do, but our birds, we hand raised a lot of our Americans. We have very large Americans, and that's what Brad attributes their size to, is that they were very gradually weaned. Once they get introduced to the flock, you notice there's some young birds in here. There's some young birds in here, the grayer ones. Any socialization they had with us kind of goes away really fast, and so we don't really worry about imprinting when we're hand raising them, because they revert back very quickly. And the nice thing is, for our imported birds, our Tanzania birds, you can tell who they are because they're still nervous around us. But having just half a dozen of our hand raised chicks has a calming effect on the whole flock. So if you guys went into the landing zone with the American flamingos, and they were coming up to people and eating out of people's hands, only I think 3 birds out of that whole flock were hand raised by people, and the birds seeing them do it, the whole flock took to it pretty fast. We didn't put a lot of effort into that, and it wasn't supposed to happen like that, and it worked out great. And we actually slowly introduced the chicks back to the main flock. By this time, when the chicks are weaned, our breeding colony of lessers has been let back out into the nesting area, or the non-breeding area. This is probably April or May or so that they're let back out. And we'll just set up a small corral, and the chicks get put out there every day, and then gradually the corral will get opened up. And we don't really see any aggression between the adults. Honestly, the most aggression I'll see is between the larger chicks pushing the adults around. but that's about it. And in the wild, you notice that you all know what crushing is, when you have large groups of chicks, and you'll have 1 or 2 sentinels, and the chicks stay like that. Penguins do the same thing, and the adults will just come in and feed their chick and then leave, and the chicks just stay together. At this point, we'll actually start introducing our chicks together, but when we're first hand raising them, they're all separated because they're pretty nasty to each other. Like I said, we started our breeding program in 2007. We hit a hiccup with there are only 15 females. Last year we had our first really good year. We actually hatched out 4 chicks. We had some bacterial problems, and we fledged 1 chick in the end. And this year we kind of had a problem with our lights, and we only hatched 1 chick again, and she's fledging, no problem. But next year we have a lot of hopes for what we're doing. A lot of our Tanzania birds are just starting to enter about 4 or 5 years old, and that's kind of prime age for them. So next year we're really, really excited about what may happen. And that's kind of all I have for you, unless you guys have questions. Yeah.
Do y'all have cat bred flamingos? You give them pinkish color. Do you got to feed them a certain diet?
Yes. We feed 2 diets. So during the breeding season, we have a Missouri breeder pellet, and that actually has pigment in it. But during the non-breeding season, they just get our waterfowl pellet, and they'll get an added purified pigment. And I think it's an algae-based pigment. Yeah.
How long does it take them to build their mud nest?
Throughout the whole breeding season, they're working on it.
And do both parents sit on it?
Yep.
Or just
The both parents, they'll switch on and off. And in terms of a pair building a nest, 1 pair doesn't build a nest. The whole group will work on the nest area together. And so that's what I was saying about having a male-male pair. Not only will they defend the nest better, but they have the best nest sites. And so you'll see a male-female pair working on a nest, and it looks great. And the next day they'll have a male-male pair sticking on it. And so what we actually do is we actually have blown flamingo eggs with a nail in them, and they're just epoxied in there. And we'll actually tie them to a nest site so they stop going around kicking off female-male pairs. And that seems to work pretty well. And then when we get those real eggs, we'll switch them out. And that's how we do that. Yeah.
What's the most difficult part of working with flamingos?
Most difficult part? They're pretty frustrating when, like I said, during the breeding season, I still haven't picked up on a lot of cues to when I know a bird's gonna lay. With waterfowl, you can see if a bird's getting heavy or something when the egg's about to drop. And I can't tell you, I'll go in there for like 2 weeks straight expecting there to be eggs. And then on the day where I'm like, there's not gonna be eggs, and there'll be an egg sitting on the nest mound. And I've been skunked that way several times. So, yeah.
Too cold for them in the winter, or not, since they're tropical species?
They do pretty well. They'll stay in the water a lot. We don't have any problems with frostbite. They're pretty hardy species in general. The lakes that they're from are alkaline, nasty lakes, and they handle the winter pretty well. Sometimes, I think a couple years ago they had a 5-degree night, and they all got pushed inside. But that's why the breeding area is set up that way, so it's just a funnel, so we can just funnel them all in. Yeah.
How many, is it just 1 egg per pair?
Yes. 1 egg per pair. And they'll go several eggs in a breeding season if they're unsuccessful. Yeah.
Have you retained your sense of smell?
I don't really smell them anymore.
I know, I don't.
Yeah.
That's the rudest.
Yeah. In the wild, they're a wild colony of flamingos. You'll smell them before you hear them, and both the smell and the hearing is deafening.
Do y'all sell to like the zoo or to the public? Or?
Not yet with our flamingos. We just got in, like I said, 10 Chilean eggs, and with Chileans you can actually sell them to the private sector too, and so that's actually why we got them in, so we could start producing them and get them in both zoos and private aviculture. But nobody heard that from me. But the lessers we don't sell because we're still getting our program off on ounce feet. And with flamingos, even non-breeding birds are still important to the breeding program because it's just about flock size. Any more questions? Thank you.